All right, let's get started. Good evening, everyone, and happy Centennial Park Month. Yes, May is Centennial Park Month. If you didn't know, in 1897, the Tennessee Centennial Exposition, which we will hear about today, opened to the public. In 1931, the Parthenon, as we see it today, opened. And in 1990, the colossal statue of Athena inside the Parthenon debuted. This is also the month we launch our Centennial Park History Tours every Wednesday at 10 a.m. from May through October, and you can find tour information on our website at nashvilleparthenon.com. And at the top of that same website, you can find information how to support the Parthenon during Centennial Park Month through tax-deductible donations, becoming a Centennial Park Conservancy member, or joining us for one of the many, many happenings in the park and in the museum, from Free Musicians Corner to Yoga in the Park to tonight's Symposium. And your participation helps sustain the vibrancy of this beloved place. So thank you for joining us live or for tuning in to watch the recording. Our virtual symposium will have a presentation and time for questions, approximately 1 hour total. You're welcome to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window at any point. I will also invite you to submit more questions at the end of the presentation, and that's when we will do our best to answer all your questions. You can also use the chat button for any comments or technical difficulties, and our Parthenon team will be able to assist tonight. So on behalf of the Parthenon, we'd like to thank Centennial Park Conservancy for supporting 100% of our exhibition and educational programming budget. Without CPC, tonight's program would not be possible. I'd also like to thank the Archaeological Institute of America Nashville Society and Metro Nashville Parks and Recreation for their support of our entire Symposia series. Our next in the series will be held in person here in Nashville at the Parthenon on August 19th during American Artist Appreciation Month. And we'll be hearing from Dr. Vivian Fried on Layers of Meaning in Benjamin West's Venus and Cupid, which is a painting in our permanent collection on display at the Parthenon. And tonight, we have a great program planned titled The Parthenon, a Pyramid and Ancient Architecture at the Tennessee Centennial of 1897. And I'm delighted to hear from our speaker. Dr. Elizabeth Macaulay is an Associate Professor of Liberal Studies, Classics, Middle Eastern Studies, and the Digital Humanities at the Graduate Center, the City University of New York. Her research examines the intersection of antiquity and modernity. And educated at Cornell and Oxford University, she is the author or editor of 6 books, including Antiquity in Gotham, The Ancient Architecture of New York City, published in 2021, and 2024's Archaeological Ambassadors, A History of Archaeological Gifts in New York City. She served as a trustee of the Archaeological Institute of America, and she chairs the board of smarthistory.org, the Center for Public Art History, where she's a regular contributor. She is currently finishing a book on ancient architecture at American World's Fairs, and we've had the honor of hosting her here at the Parthenon during her research. So Dr. Macaulay, thank you for joining us, and feel free to start when you are ready.
Thank you so much. It is a real pleasure to be with you. To be honest, I wish I could come and do yoga in Centennial Park from New York, but sadly this will have to do. So let me share my screen. Let me do this, and then let me just do that. And hopefully now you can see everything just fine and you don't see my time. But yes, thank you so much. Perfect. Thank you so much for having me tonight. I have to say everyone has been so kind and so supportive of my research. So it's a delight for me to get to share some of what I've been working on with all of you. And I'm delighted to speak to an audience who probably knows a great deal about the Parthenon and the Tennessee Centennial Exposition. So I hope I'll have an opportunity to bring you some new research and answer your questions. So as this audience knows very well, that the Parthenon is the only surviving building, obviously in a rebuilt form, from the highly successful Tennessee Centennial Exposition of 1897, which celebrated the centennial of Tennessee's admission to the Union and heralded Nashville's arrival as a modern city on the cusp of the 20th century. The organizers of the Tennessee Centennial Exposition turned to classical architecture, but most particularly to the monuments of Athens, to create a kind of ancient architectural fantasy landscape that drew upon Greek, Roman, and even Egyptian architecture. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is what I call neo-antique architecture, which is kind of a scholarly construct that I created with a colleague, Catherine von Spockelberg, to look at ancient architecture in the modern world. And this is kind of thinking that when we look at lots of the modern world architecture and art created in the 18th, 19th, and early 20th century, there's a lot of ancient stuff that pops up from around the Mediterranean world, the ancient Mediterranean. And so what I found, or what I find is interesting, is that Greek, Roman, classical, those kind of rubrics of classical architecture, but as well as Egyptian and ancient Near Eastern architecture also shows up, and that they're being used in similar ways. So I kind of use this umbrella term of neo-antique to get us out of thinking that this is just classical. And so on the slide here, you can see an arch that was erected at the San Francisco World's Fair, the Panama Pacific International Exposition, and the Temple of Luxor at the Columbian Exhibition in Chicago. And just to show that this is a broader phenomenon and to kind of situate the architecture also of the Tennessee Centennial Exposition in this larger tradition and trends that are going on. Okay, and as we'll see, ancient Egyptian architecture has an important role to play at the Tennessee Centennial Exposition. Okay, so the decision to host an exhibition in Nashville was connected to the overwhelming, huge success of the Chicago Columbian Exhibition, or the Chicago World Fair of 1893. This fair, which was visited by approximately 27 million Americans, huge number, really was both Chicago's statement that it was a city that mattered, and the United States statement to the world that, in fact, we were here and the United States could compete economically, politically, and artistically and culturally with basically Europe. And here's the Court of Honor and the Statue Republic, which was one of the prominent monuments. But because this was so successful, other cities across the United States immediately said, wow, we should have fairs. And so the first fair that was held in the southeastern part of the United States was in Atlanta in 1895. But shortly thereafter, Nashville would follow in 1897. And because ancient architecture had been so successful in Chicago, it's unsurprising that it was deployed here. Now, in this image, which you'll see throughout this talk, this is a bird's eye view of the Tennessee Centennial Exposition. It is actually incorrect. You'll see that there is a pyramid. I'm going to roll my cursor over it. There is a pyramid off on the right part of your screen to the Parthenon, which you can see is in the center. But this helps you to kind of understand that really there was this kind of artificial classical landscape that was created and would also then, of course, lead to the creation of Centennial Park. So the Tennessee Centennial Exposition was the most successful of all the Southern World's Fairs. Now, Nashville was a small city. It had a population of 81,000 people in 1900. So it was really aimed to give Nashville a boost as a city and also to the state of Tennessee. In 1893, there was a huge economic depression across the United States. And so one motivation was to bring economic interest, revenue, and capital to Nashville and to Tennessee. The other thing, of course, is that the South was still in the process of recovery from the Civil War. And so trying to kind of generate interest and investment in industry and manufacturing was also a prominent thing. So part of it is showing that industrialization was afoot and that the South had a modern economy. Also connected to that was undoubtedly the justification of the development of Jim Crow laws and racial segregation as a means for quote unquote, integrating African Americans in the post-Civil War society. Lastly, so it has a number of political aims, economic aims, social aims. The other thing, the goal of this fair was to demonstrate that Nashville was a cosmopolitan city with cultural and artistic chops to compete with other modern metropolises, certainly Chicago and New York, but also possibly London or Paris. Now, this fair, as you can see, was a classical wonderland, and the Parthenon was at the heart of it. So there's this envisioned connection to the ancient world, and particularly to Athens, but it was also very much connected to local traditions. And that's really due to a number of important things. And part of it is most originally that Nashville has long ties or conceptual ties to the ancient world. So there are going to be other cities that use ancient architecture like Omaha that have no kind of created or thought through or rhetorical ties to the ancient world. However, Nashville had been co-opting narratives and ties to the ancient world since the late 18th century when it was founded. Part of that is because in the 1780s, when Nashville was founded, Athens and Rome were central to political ideas in the United States. This is when the founding fathers are looking to Athenian democracies, to the Athenian democracy of the 5th century BCE and to the Roman Republic as models for governance. So these are really, not only do we have kind of the intellectual ideas that are circulating in the milieu, but also starting to be artistic ideas. Thomas Jefferson, of course, is going to build a number of buildings that are modeled on ancient Roman and Greek models, actually particularly ancient Roman models. But in the early part of the 19th century, there were three individuals who were really important for kind of solidifying Nashville's ties to the ancient world. And those start with President Andrew Jackson. So Andrew Jackson, of course, the people's president, was originally from North Carolina. I'm correct. Apologies. I can't remember that. So if he's supposed to be South Carolina, my apologies. But his primary residence is obviously a place that many of you will know incredibly well, which is the Hermitage. And the Hermitage suffered a major fire. And so it was rebuilt in 1834 to 1837. And it was rebuilt in the style of the time. And here you can see the facade in front of it. And it basically received a Corinthian facade. So it was very much modeled on the contemporary, very popular architectural style at that moment, which is the Greek Revival style, which is popular all over the United States. And part of that, starting in the 1820s, there's a real interest again in Greek and things that are Grecian and Greek, because the Greeks are fighting a war for independence against the Ottoman Turks, which is very, very well known, is supported, in principle by the United States and a number of other nations. But it really means that Greek ideals are in the forefront of Americans' ideas. So Andrew Jackson has a very prominent house that is built in Greek Revival style. The other thing is that Nashville, throughout most of the 19th century, but definitely in textual sources by the mid-19th century, is referred to either as the Athens of the West or the Athens of the South. I thought it was really fascinating because I had heard the reference to the Athens of the South, but had not heard the Athens of the West. But what's interesting in reading 19th century newspapers is both of those two kind of names are used. And this was in large part due to Philip Lindsay, who had been the president of the University of Nashville from 1825 to 1850, and also to the fact that Nashville has always had a very large number of universities, obviously including Vanderbilt, as well as Fisk and Roger Williams universities, both historically Black colleges. For example, W.E.D. Du Bois was educated and was a graduate of Fisk University. Also interesting, Latin and Greek were both, the teaching of the languages of Latin and Greek were both part of the curriculum at Fisk and Roger Williams University. So there is this kind of idea of intellectualism, learning. This is a seat of knowledge. What is the most prominent seat of knowledge from the ancient world? Well, it is Athens. If you are interested in philosophy, of course, ancient Roman senators and well-to-do would send their sons off to get a proper education in Athens and learn about rhetoric and philosophy. So this really grounds it to that connection. But we also have another physical grounding, which is the Tennessee State Capitol building, which I was so lucky to finally get to see when I was down doing my research. It's so impressive up on the hill, you can't not see it. So and it just dominates in a way that I find really fascinating. Even when you have lots of tall buildings, it still has a really prominent physical space in the city. So this was designed by William Strickland, who was a former student of the famed architect Benjamin Latrobe. He was also the designer of the Second Bank of the United States in Philadelphia, which is basically modeled after the Parthenon, which was completed in 1834. But he designed this building. So here you can see not only is there an Ionic facade supporting the pediment and the big porch, but it's also its top is modeled on the Choreic monument of Lysicrates from Athens. This was a monument erected by a victor in one of the choral competitions that they would have in ancient Athens, but it's a very prominent monument that ends up showing up on lots of different buildings. We have it on buildings here in New York City as well. But so it's a very well-known building, so it's a very potent architectural reference, and you go, oh, that's something Athenian. And so really you can see that even before we get to the organizers of the fair thinking, oh, what are we going to do that's going to make our fair stand out architecturally? You are going to think about the monuments that you already have and the ties and character of your city. So what we can really see is that there is already an ancient grounding point in much of the pre-existing landscape of Nashville, both intellectually and literally in the landscape itself. So with all of this in the background, the Centennial Company, led by Nashville's political movers and economic shakers, selected 200 acres west of End Park as the Exposition site in August 1895. So the fair was dedicated on May 1st, 1896, which was actually the year of the centennial of the admission of the state of Tennessee, but the fair was celebrated the year later. This is also what happened in Chicago, because it actually, even if you're building a bunch of temporary buildings, it takes a lot of time, and so they needed an extra year. Now, this fair was the largest and by far and away the most financially successful of all the Southern fairs. It had almost 1.8 million visitors, which is really a lot. It was directed by Major Eugene Kastner Lewis, who was responsible for the grounds and the architecture. So not only was there this very prominent fairgrounds here, but there was also a fun zone, which you can see in the back here. You'll see a Ferris wheel. For those of you who don't know, Ferris wheels made their debut at the Chicago World's Fair. The man's name was Ferris, George Ferris, who created it. So we have the World's Fairs to thanks for many things. Ferris wheels are one of them. But there was, where the Ferris wheel is located is called Vanity Fair, and that was kind of the fun zone. So one thing that we see with many of these fairs is that they're kind of designed to educate and entertain, and that can be a bit of a blurry space. So they're meant to be fun, but there's also a lot of self-improvement that's supposed to be going on. Okay, so if you're going to come to this fabulous, amazing architectural landscape, you would arrive most likely by train or trolley, and you would go through, if you're going through the main entrance, this spectacular Doric portico. And this was located at the southwest boundary of the fair between Fountain Avenue and Lake Catherine. And it sets the stage. You know you're going into someplace different, and you're going into this kind of ancient fantasy land. And you can see that because not only are there columns, but there is a goddess there on top to welcome you. As you can see in the caption from this publication, this was Miss Enid Yandel, who we'll come to, who was from Louisville, Kentucky, and was one of the most prominent, most successful sculptors of her day. And this is a smaller version of the statue that she will create for the actual Parthenon. So when you get in here, you kind of already have a sense. But the real building, the building you had to see, was the Parthenon. And the Parthenon is truly an architectural gem. And one of the reasons why it is so fascinating for archaeologists to look at is to try and understand what we don't have. People love to do virtual reality, all of these things today, but in some ways, like, this is the original virtual reality in terms of trying to recreate a building. Now, apparently, Director General Lewis conceived of the Parthenon at the inception of the fair and kind of saw it as the fair's architectural hallmark. I mean, this is one of the things that's going to make it different from Chicago. It's going to make it different from Atlanta. They have a Parthenon. Nobody else has ever had a Parthenon before. And so this gives the fair organizer, something very original, something to promote, but also is actually quite a remarkable undertaking. And the reason why it's so remarkable is that it is really a, call it an exact replica of the original, but it's really, really impressively close. Okay, so we're going to talk about how it was constructed and how what I would say archaeological knowledge and information was displayed through the creation of this building. So obviously the original Parthenon was made of stone. This one was made of brick covered with stucco on a wooden frame. Stone would be impractical to build because it would take too long and be incredibly expensive. But what's interesting, so we have an adjustment of the materials. But then what Lewis did, which is quite interesting, is he requested architectural and archaeological studies, photographs, and drawings from King George I of Greece. So he says, we need to have information. He also looked at Jack Carey's 1674 drawings of the sculpture of the original Parthenon before it was partially destroyed due to the explosion of the ammunition that was being stored in the middle of the Parthenon, which kind of totally obliterated large chunks of sculpture. So he's requested original documents. He's looking at Carey's sketch building. And Lewis reportedly got a copy of the book from London for the price of $75, which is actually a huge amount of money to spend at that point. Okay, so based on Penrose's work was based on his visits to Athens in 1845 and 1846, and it included measured drawings, a detailed discussion of proportions, dimensions, and detailed measurements. So you really have a lot of information. So then what Lewis did was hire Captain William C. Smith to serve as the architect of the Parthenon. And so what Smith did was actually to go through the books, to go through all the papers that Lewis had loaned him and researched and designed the building on the basis of that. What he also intended to do was incorporate a large number of the original Parthenon's refinements. So one of the reasons why the Parthenon is such an exceptional building, the ancient Parthenon, the one in Athens, is it has all of these like very subtle tweaks that make it visually look better to our eyes. And so what's interesting is that Smith really wanted to include those, but for some unknown reason, which I cannot determine, the contractor, Edward Laurent, refused to put most of them in. I wonder if he just couldn't do them. Possibly, who knows? But there were some of those details which were included. Most notably, the columns had entasis, which is a very subtle swelling of the centers of the columns, which actually makes them appear taller and more elegant rather than short and squat to the human eye. And that is something that the Athenian Parthenon is really renowned for. So this kind of attention to detail allowed the official historian Hermann Justi to boast, quite rightly, that, quote unquote, all the best authorities were carefully studied, unquote, for the Nashville Parthenon. So what's really interesting to me is that there's clearly a tremendous amount of information and knowledge. There's an emphasis on accuracy and thoughtfulness that is going into this. And as the Nashville Banner reported, that, this building was, quote, as faithful a reproduction as is possible with our present knowledge. Actually, that's a pretty good claim. It's not even that boasty, I would say. Now, what's interesting is they do have to make certain modifications. So one issue is there were two different sculptural groups on the facades of the original Athenian Parthenon. The battle between Poseidon, to be the patron god of Athens, which was originally on the building's western pediment, was reproduced then on both sides of the Parthenon, rather than the potential birth of Athena on the other. And that's partially because the eastern pediment was in such terrible condition. So that's an important thing to note, that the original sculpture on the Nashville Parthenon is different than on the Parthenon today. There were tweaks made in the 1920s when the building was being reconstructed. The other thing that you will see is that there are the metopes. So that's this part in between the triglyphs underneath the pedimental structure. And those all have scenes of centaurs fighting lapis. So this is a centauromachi, and they used those were originally from the south side of the Parthenon, and they're used on all of the different friezes simply due to the fact that they were the ones that are in the best keys. And they'd also been very well drawn by Carey. And so sculptor Franz Engelsmann and his assistants who were creating the sculptures used those studies for their work. Now, the thing though that was really interesting to me when I looked at this picture and I started looking at historical photos, I noticed something. I was like, oh, it's really easy to see the sculpture here. I wonder if the backgrounds are painted. It looks to me like the backgrounds behind all this sculpture is painted, which would have been what would have been the case in antiquity. So in antiquity, one of the things that's really important to know and remember is that all the sculpture was painted. Everything was painted. I mean, you could use polychrome, different colored marbles, but then everything else was painted. So it was really a world of Technicolor or world of polychromy. And one of the reasons why it's really important to paint sculpture is that it's really hard if you are on the ground looking 50 feet in the air, 70 feet in the air, and you're trying to make out sculptures. If they're all the same color, it's really hard to see. And if you also add very bright Mediterranean sun, it's even harder. So one of the reasons why you need color, and we know things were painted because we have really good surviving examples of it, is that it actually makes it easier for you to see from the ground. And one of the most important things, if an ancient temple is designed as a home for a god, people need to know which god it is. They need to be impressed by it. They need to interact with it. So one thing that became very clear with me is that there was actually color used in the backgrounds. And that's why it's really, really easy to actually see all this sculpture. And that's one of the reasons why it's easy to look at the sculpture today on the current Parthenon. You can actually really see the figures really easily. But what's fascinating is that this use of color was very positively reviewed at the time. And that's partially because, as the Nashville Banner reports, that these colors were the types of colors that were used in antiquity. And that this is thus another aspect of accuracy in the building, is the fact that there was color being used. And I think that that's really interesting to note because today there's so many debates, largely coming from people who haven't studied the ancient world and go, oh, all this was all white. This white aesthetic is a function of Johann Winkelmann in the 18th century. And he was like, I like the pretty white sculpture. That was not how sculpture looked. Sculpture was painted. And so it's a really important thing to know that, the aesthetics that people have in different periods are just different. So anyway, the other reason why we also know that color was used is that Penrose in his plates also used a lot of color. So I think that that may have also been another source of inspiration. So of course there had to be modifications made. You have to have the building work. Also on the inside, it's really important that it actually functions well to show art, because the first exhibition of works of art ever staged in Nashville was staged in the Parthenon. And it's actually really significant because there were about 1,200 works of art shown. But there were both contemporary American painters who were shown next to European old masters like Rembrandt and Titian. I think that's really important because that is really an example of the United States and Nashville and Tennessee articulating that it is a place of culture, and that American arts and the works that Americans are doing are as good as what the old masters and the Europeans are doing. Also, this idea of kind of temples as having treasuries is kind of connected. It doesn't seem to be modeled on ancient treasury buildings, but there seems to be this connection of the idea that temples had spaces for goods and votives and treasures to be held. That seems to tie up there. Now, in this picture, you can also see an enormous 40-foot tall statue of Athena. And that was created by Inidiano. And it took her between 9 to 10 months to create. Now, she was the daughter of a very, very well-regarded family, but she was also an incredibly impressive sculptor. Here's a wonderful picture of her. I love this one because it gives you a sense of scale for everything. She was educated in Chicago and in Europe. And she was elected to the National Sculpture Society, which was the first organization of sculptors in the United States. So that really reflects her prominence as a sculptor, let alone a woman sculptor at the time. So this statue, when it was created, was the largest one ever created by a woman at the time, which many of the sources like to report regularly. And it was shipped in 3 pieces from her studio in Paris. The head of her Athena had to wait for about 3 months on the docks because it was so big it wouldn't fit on the gangplank to get to the ship that it was supposed to go on. Eventually it did there. Eventually it got there, as you can see. But this was modeled on another ancient statue. It was modeled on the Palace Athena or the Palace of Velletri. This is a statue of Athena or Minerva. It's thought to be the way that scholars traditionally looked at a sculpture like this, would they say, well, it's a Roman copy of a Greek original. But we don't necessarily know exactly what the original Greek looked like. Maybe it's interpreted differently. And so I think scholars have stepped away from that a little bit. But at that moment in time, this would have been seen or understood as a statue of Athena, which you can see from the breastplate. So of course, if you have the Parthenon, you need to have Athena as well. And one of the things, again, why this was so widely celebrated in the press was the fact that it was such a good copy of this statue, which is in the Louvre. So the other thing is, this is, again, another example of Americans replicating a European example, but also one that's in a very prominent museum in Europe. It's in the Louvre. It's in Paris. It is a place that Americans, who are starting on their equivalent of they're not quite a grand tour, but the movement of Americans to Europe, a la, Henry James, Edith Wharton, Joe, was it? No, not Joe, the youngest one in Little Women, who's now, I can't forget, who's the painter. Oh, goodness, her name escapes me. But that whole thing of Americans going to Europe. So this would also be a signaling of Americans being very, very cognizant and aware of European sculpture. So what I think is interesting both about the Parthenon and about Athena as well is that these are both created in kind of archaeologically informed ways. They're not necessarily always accurate in terms of scholarship and content, but they are really trying to do something highly veristic, and I think and highly effective. And what together they do is they really say, this is a new Athens. Nashville is the new Athens. We are a center of culture. We are a center of learning. And we can do it as well as anybody in the world. And so I think that that really is a very clear statement of Nashville's identity as a city and as a place. Now, this was not the only classical building you would see Greek or Grecian or Roman. As I've shown you this slide a number of times, you can start to look around and you'll met with columns and domes and facades everywhere. And I think that what's important is the Parthenon really is at the center. So it grounds the whole composition, the whole landscape. But many of the buildings, as you will see, just a few selections, were really connected to the ancient world. And so unsurprisingly, the history building is like a little mini Ionic temple. Actually, the order there is very, very similar to that of the Erechtheion, also a building from Athens, from the Athenian Acropolis. So that's a little reference to history. In the history building, there were displays about ancient history, but also contemporary history related to the Civil War. The women's building was a combination of the Hermitage on the bottom and the Parthenon on the top. And that's quite relevant, particularly due to the fact because women were instrumental in the preservation of the Hermitage. And it also sits on this kind of interesting line that women are increasingly working outside of the home. Women are starting to work in factories. And what is the role of women? And this building, in some ways reiterates a more traditional narrative, although there was definitely dissent within boards about what should be going on here, which was really, should women be the keeper of the domestic sphere and history and supportive and not do other things? African-American women were really not very prominent at the building and did not have an opportunity to be involved in a board, although they were able to organize certain events. So you can see where there's a kind of cultural component, but there's also something very much connected to commercialism and this idea of maybe aggrandizing railroads, commerce, and natural resources. So minerals and forests are here partially because natural resources are an increasingly important part of the economy, and lumber, granites, other types of things like that are very important. One building that I think is quite striking is the machinery building, largely because the center part is modeled on a very prominent building from Munich. And it's kind of interesting in this way. So this is the Propylaea, which was designed by Leo van Kluntz in 1862. And it was erected in Munich to mark the ascension of Otto, the son of King Ludwig I of Bavaria as the king of Greece. So what's interesting is Klimt was actually doing archaeological work and research and drawing on the Propylaea in Athens on the Athenian Acropolis. This is the big monumental gateway, which we really don't have a lot that survives of. And so he had kind of recreated or envisioned it in Munich. And then this building is then kind of replicated and recreated in Nashville. And what's striking about that is that one of the ways, again, that American architects and designers are interacting with ancient culture is through the Europeans as a kind of lens, as a kind of point of refraction and reflection to understand these ancient worlds. And also, again, to nod to the fact that they're aware of the trends in European art. They're aware of the new buildings. So that's what part of this is going on. So really, there's a lot of highlighting august cultural means, but also saying that these economic drivers, machinery is important, but it's as grand, it's as important. It too can have columns and be important and relevant, is partially what the building's trying to do. So, as I've said, there's a lot of classical and Roman and ancient architecture here from the classical world, but there was also a pyramid. I've got to talk about the pyramid because this is one of the things that I don't think is as well known. That Shelby County, home to Memphis, in fact, for its pavilion, had a pyramid. And so I want to talk a little bit about that today. So the first thing to say is that I showed you earlier the Luxor Temple from Chicago, which showed that somebody built an entire temple. But this is totally original. And the reason why this was built was partially that Shelby County, basically put out a call for architects to submit examples in August 1896. And James B. Cook, who was a British architect who lived in Memphis for like 40 years, did not go for something normal or traditional. Instead, what he did was say we should have a pyramid because Memphis is located on the banks and starting to be in the delta of the Mississippi. And so this association of Memphis being on the banks of a really prominent river is very similar to, of course, its namesake, Memphis, Egypt. And so what could be more Egyptian than a pyramid? I mean, pyramids, you go, ooh, it's Egypt. And so the model for this pyramid, for Shelby County's pyramid, was the Great Pyramid at Giza, also known as Khufu's Pyramid or Cheops's Pyramid. And this was basically constructed around 2500 BCE. And until 1889, it was the tallest structure in the world. The only thing that passed it was the Eiffel Tower. So this is a really big, tall, prominent monument. So for Shelby County to do this, it's a way of saying, again, we are here and we are back. The post-Civil War era had not been kind to Shelby County or to Memphis in particular. Memphis went bankrupt and it lost its city charter in 1879 and had major population decline. It had a series of outbreaks of cholera and other waterborne diseases in the 1870s and 1880s. In the mid-1880s, there started to be sanitary reforms, and that meant they kind of got cholera and other waterborne diseases under control. And eventually, the city was granted a new charter in 1893. There was also increased cotton trading and the development of a lumber market. So Memphis was kind of on its way back up from where it had been. So the fair is really an opportunity for Memphis to say, we're back and we're better than ever. But if you'll notice, looking at the pyramid, I have not commented upon the obvious weird thing, which is that there are porticos stuck in the side of it, which truly, when I first saw this, as somebody who's done some work in Egypt, also knows Cestius's pyramid, I was like, this is strange. Now, granted, in Brooklyn, we also have pyramids that are in Greenwood Cemetery that have weird entrances too, but I hadn't found those. This was the first thing that I came across, and I was like, this is crazy, but fascinating. So the reason why there are porticos is because you need them because you have to get in to the inside of the pyramid because that's actually where all the goods, all the services, all the things from Shelby County and Memphis are actually on display. Now, what's interesting is we do have a primary source which is by Joseph R. Williams, which is the official account of the pyramid. It's called The Builders of the Pyramid, The Story of Shelby County, Its Resources and Developments. This is a highly unreliable document, I would say, that is an unmitigated puff piece, PR publicity piece of information, but it does have some evidence that's helpful, and we can cross-check that with other sources. So the pyramid was about 115 feet on each side, but the porticos are added, and actually in William's account, he says, well, porticos are really well known in Egypt, which he's right about, except nobody ever puts porticos with pyramids in Egypt. So there's kind of a lack of information. And one of the things here that Williams is trying to do is he's trying to emphasize in the writing in this account that it's very accurate, but it's really not. It's been highly modified to suit the purposes. But what is interesting is that there's color here again, and that color was used, which was very typical of Egyptian architecture. So here you see a much more kind of, I would say, loosey-goosey, for lack of a better term, interpretation of this. So when you would go inside, there were all these little pyramids of different goods, different natural resources from Shelby County that you could see. So it was kind of playing on this idea. There was also a central column that had faux hieroglyphs on it. So it's a little bit more, I don't know, fanciful and not so accurate. And while the building in theory is designed to educate people about ancient Egypt, it really doesn't. And even the official catalog says you'll help you, if you go there, you'll learn about the mother civilization, which is something we hear Egypt described a lot that way in the 19th century, and about archaeology. But in fact, really, you would just learn really about what you could buy from Shelby County or from Memphis. The other thing that is problematic about Williams is his promotion of a ridiculous theory. And his theory, even though he says he's read things like, the works of Sir John Gardner Wilkinson, who is the father of British Egyptology, he says he has a new theory that somebody has told him. No source, which was basically that Job from the Old Testament had created the pyramids, which is fascinating because that's basically an attempt at Christianization, even though it's the Old Testament, but it's kind of putting the monument in a biblical and Christian tradition. And one of the things that we see particularly when Egyptian forms are used, is people, contemporary sources, finding this a little hard to deal with. They're like, these are all pagan monuments, and that's not great, but we really like them. So how do we justify or rewrite history to say that somehow these are in a Christian tradition? And so it's also interesting because it then deprives the Egyptians, as people from North Africa or Africa, it deprives them of their creativity in that regard. So it's a kind of interesting thing to see some of these tensions about race, ethnicity that very much exist in the 1890s. They're kind of lying under the surface here. I should say I've not talked about the Negro building tonight because that was not built in a neo-antique style. It was not really built using ancient forms. In fact, so that's the reason why I haven't talked about it tonight, just as a side note. The last thing to say is that the pyramid was, in fact, very close to the Parthenon. So this is why you always have to verify. Bird's eye views are often spectacularly beautiful, and they're wonderfully produced. They're not often accurate. So you have to kind of, trust but verify, or verify but trust. So as you can see here, this pyramid is really close to the Parthenon. So that is also interesting because it really brings them close together. And it highlights the importance of basically Tennessee as a region. But here you can also see this is kind of like a classical ancient wonderland. And in the back is a giant seesaw, which was also super popular. Now, if you were going off you decide you've had enough culture, you've learned all the things you're supposed to learn, let's go have some fun. You would head off to Vanity Fair, you'd go see that giant seesaw, and you'd have a lovely time. While you were there, you could also go visit the streets of Cairo. So while Shelby County had some semblance of trying to maybe have a pyramid and have a reference, the streets of Cairo was not aiming to be educational in any way, which is very different from the way the streets of Cairo functioned at Chicago. This is about fun and games, to be perfectly frank. What is fascinating and confusing is you look at this, if you've worked in Egypt, this looks like a very poor interpretation of an Egyptian pylon or monumental gateway. It kind of has columns that might have lotuses or might have papyrus on them, and it's painted. Please note it's painted, and it has, figures that look like they should be on some grand Egyptian tomb. There seems to be a winged solar disk. There's a cavetto cornice. It's also a little confusing, though, if you also look at the top, because you can see where it would be illuminated at night, and then there's a crescent moon, and you would go in from this ancient looking building into basically something that looked like you'd walked into modern Cairo. And you can also look at the way everyone is dressed. They are not dressed like ancient Egyptians. They are dressed in some cross semblance of contemporary dress, contemporary Western dress, and contemporary North African dress. And really here, what they are selling you is fun and games and an exotic East. As I always say, this is always very perturbing to me when I see this, because Cairo was not founded until the 10th century CE. It's founded by the Fatimids, which is an Islamic dynasty. So there's no way that the streets of Cairo from this portal could ever exist. But that's me being pedantic as an archaeologist. The whole point was, this is a way for you, if you are visiting the fair, to go visit an exotic other land that you would never have another opportunity to see. And so could you please pay your 10-cent admission and go in and do this, because this is how you'll be entertained and, in theory, learn something about Egypt. So one of the things that is, there's always kind of this interesting underplay between educational and entertainment. As I mentioned before, this was a space that was not super interested in education. It was much more about entertainment. So as you guys know, eventually the fair ends. The beloved Parthenon hangs out and kind of falls into disrepair and is rebuilt for most of the 1920s and reopens in 1931. And what's remarkable to me about the building today, and one of the reasons why it was such a privilege and pleasure to come see it, is how much paint and color was still used, and that intellectual idea that started in the fair continued in the version in the 1920s. Also, what was fascinating, and this is something that's really an interesting testament, which is when this was being rebuilt, the person who was the archaeologist who was consulted was William Bell Dinsmore, who wrote basically the book in English on ancient Greek architecture. And so again, the organizers, the people creating this a second time, said, how do we do this and how can we do it right? And that there is a kind of there is an underlying tone of education and information and accuracy that underlies this building to this very day. And obviously that can be seen in the Athena statue, which when it was created by Alan LaQuarrie, he went and consulted with Eve Harrison and Bernie Ridgway, two of the leading sculpture experts of ancient Greek sculpture, two of the leading scholars, one at Bryn Mawr and one at the IFA at NYU. And he went and looked at different sculptures, but then he talked to them. He actually had Bernie Ridgway come to his studio and give him feedback, which suggests a very different type of process for creating and for engaging with past knowledge and recreation. Now, I have to say, one of the things that I felt how this building continues to be effective is that when I was visiting, Helen very kindly took me up the stairs and I was able to come in and I saw her and I gasped. I had never seen anything like this. I think, for somebody who studies the ancient world, I'd never fully been able to conceptualize how much people believed in their ancient gods. But when I saw Athena like this, I was ready to sign up to be a priest or priestess because she was so striking. How could you not believe that this person, this goddess, had power and authority? And so one of the things that I think continues to be remarkable about the Parthenon and about Athena is it still is a portal. It is a way back to understand ancient Athens, but also to understand the ideals and the goals of Nashville and Tennessee in the 1890s, which means it's an interesting way of learning how the past continues to connect to today and to the future and beyond. And so with that, I would just like to say thank you so much for having me, and I'd love to have any questions. I'm just going to stop my screen sharing. Okay, you do that. Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. That was so incredibly fascinating. And I have some pages of notes and questions, but at this point, I will open it up and invite everyone who's joining us live to be able to use the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window In that Q&A box, you are more than welcome to type a question, and I will ask that question of our speaker, and we will hope to answer all of them. So take a couple moments and type those questions up. I will say we have one already from a self-professed Alcott nerd who wanted to share that Amy March is the youngest in the March family.
Thank
So,
you. Thank you. It's one of
we
my
have
favorite
that.
books too, and I could only think of like various different actresses who'd played her in the two different recent, like quasi recent renditions. I was like, Florence Pugh. No, that is not who the name of it is. So, yes, thank you. I appreciate that. I'm terrified that I blanked on it.
I'd like to start off with a question that, as staff at the Parthenon, we get a lot here. And I'm wondering if you have run into this with other expositions. A major question, and actually I'm just seeing this pop into the chat now, is about what happens to the buildings. And I'm also wondering to the statues, and if that has any connections to the role they play or if it's a financial decision. So I'll share the question in the chat since it's along the same line. When were all the other buildings torn down and why weren't they kept?
Great questions. And these are kind of all interconnected. And also I will put this in the larger context of what happens at other fairs too. So the first thing is many of these things were always intended to be temporary. That's the first thing. Nothing was ever designed to be permanent. So they're largely built on staff structures. And staff is basically like plaster of Paris, it's stucco. And so it's fine inside a building, but on the outside, eventually things start to deteriorate. And part of it is if you want to create and build this many buildings, and quickly, this is the only way to really do it, because you simply run out of time and you run out of money. So some of them were never intended ever to be there. So what happens, at least in some of the fairs, is they salvage a lot of the materials and they sell it off. So sometimes they wreck things. Sometimes there are fires, like Chicago has a fire. Omaha sells a bunch of things off. So there's a number of different ways that happens. Now, with some of the sculpture, what happens if sometimes, so the sculpture is kind of two-pronged. If the originals that were shown were made of permanent materials, actually, there's a lot of really famous works of art that are shown at various different World's Fairs, and they get replicated or copied. A lot of times with the sculptures in particular, people do editions of the sculptures. So that happens. Now, in other cases, the sculptures are ephemeral. So like nobody, I mean, I like kind of wish Athena had survived because I kind of love seeing the scale and the size, but that doesn't survive. And so I think part of it is there was this acceptance that it was temporary. But there are different interesting legacies. So in most cases, one thing survives, like one building survives. It's a disproportionately number of the fine arts buildings survive. And I don't know if that's partially because there's this association of these were cultural events. And then so that often happens. And then it's often connected to the creation of parks. So it's not just in Centennial Park that there's a whole new park, but that happens in Chicago. It happens in Omaha. San Francisco, it doesn't, you kind of have the fine arts pavilion there. And it also happens in St. Louis. So it's actually, the other thing is that the fairgrounds often become parks that are highly valued. So it's a weird and different legacy that we get. But yes, they were always meant to be temporary, which is something we don't really think about. But I don't know. I mean, I live in New York, and so whenever somebody's putting up a skyscraper, you're like, okay, so we're gonna wait for another 10 years. I assume it's probably similar in Nashville when people are building new buildings. So anyway, I hope that answers the question.
Yes, thank you. I think we had similar veins of thinking. I know at least in after the exposition here, many of the buildings were kind of torn down right away. I think maybe the history building was the only one that remained for a little bit. So the kind of Erection adjacent building and the Parthenon were neighbors. I had another question I had was connected to the pyramid, the Shelby County building. And the fact that it does have these porticos, which ancient pyramids did not. And you mentioned it kind of is probably related to it needing to function with entrances and exits. I also wonder, there could have been a way to have, porticos on a side where the main view wouldn't be. So I wonder, does it having these kind of modern additions, I wonder if you can talk about to what extent does that sort of diminish sort of the historical accuracy of other buildings, or were they more seen as separate things and this is more of a modern marvel rather than taking away from accuracy and replication?
I think it more is the latter of kind of modern marvel. It's a little bit like we're going to improve what we're going to improve upon what one has and make it better. It's the kind of American, and I don't want to immediately just pick on the Americans, but it's a little bit like we can do it better, or also like we have to adapt things to make them work. And so in that sense, I don't begrudge them doing it. What's interesting in the Williams piece about it is like, he's like, they had porticos. And so it's totally great that we put them here. And it's like, well, or you could just say you kind of mashed them up because you needed to, and that's okay too. But that's very much what I've just said is very much a 20th century academic, 21st century perspective. Somebody writing in the 1890s does not think that way. And so part of what I do enjoy about reading some of these sources is like getting into the psychology of people in a different way. And I think that's something you have to do. It's a little bit like the pyramids that we have in Brooklyn, like Henry Berg, who is the founder of the ASPCA. He's got like an Egyptian, like you have a little like, pylon, you have a curvetto cornice and you go in through the door and then he's got a pyramid. So it's this mix mashing, but it's partially to make it functional. So yeah, it's kind of bonkers, but I love the adaptation nature of it when I first saw that, because also I think people know about the Parthenon, but maybe don't know about the pyramid because it didn't survive. It was just so much fun for me to find that.
I'll read a comment from the Q&A as well. And the comment is, excellent lecture. Thank you very much indeed. As a retired world history teacher, your presentation will make their upcoming visit after first visiting over 25 years ago, a very rich visit indeed. So what a lovely comment to have.
Oh, thank you. Well,
I have another question here in the chat. Is the Nashville Parthenon well known in your field?
I think it is getting better well known than it used to be. I think the people who do Greek architecture know it super well because they do Greek architecture. But I think the people who do Roman and other things are not immediately as aware of it. So one subfield in classical studies is the thing called reception studies, which specifically looks at like the afterlife, or like, why do people find the ancient world so fascinating? And I have a lovely colleague who was like, there's a person who is not from the United States. I think Americans know it too. This is a super fabulous colleague who lives abroad and is not American. I was like, there's a Parthenon in Nashville. And he was like, I did not. And so he went to visit and he was thrilled to see it. So I think it's an uneven thing but it's a little bit that makes sense because, for example, if you're in Australia, the Shrine of Remembrance is in Melbourne, and it's a combination of the Mausoleum of Halicarnassus and the Parthenon. And it's super weird looking. But if you're Australian, it's the Shrine of Remembrance. So you know that. And you would know that building. But an American wouldn't. Like the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in India is a tetrapylon arch. Again, not something Americans would necessarily know, not something Brits would necessarily know, but somebody who's Indian will know that. And so I think there's that what thing is so cool about these buildings is they're kind of like everywhere in weird places, but there's certain people know certain things. And so what I love about being able to do a talk like this is hopefully share other knowledge with other people, and also show the world that, everyone should go to Nashville to basically have a lovely time at the Parthenon, among other things.
Well, we will definitely echo that statement for sure. We have one more comment that just came in. Absolutely fascinating and always a pleasure to be in audience with Professor Macaulay Lewis. So again, another wonderful comment to finish off our virtual symposium today. I would like to thank everyone in the audience for joining us and helping us celebrate Centennial Park Month with a wonderful talk about the Tennessee Centennial Exposition. I'd like to thank our speaker, Dr. Macaulay, once again for sharing her research, her expertise, and her knowledge about expositions, world's fairs, and many more things with us today. We hope to see you all at our next symposium, which will be in person at the Parthenon on August 19th. Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you're the first to know about all the exciting things happening at the Nashville Parthenon.